All right, I'm here with Ian Gregory, formerly of the BBC, and a contributor to our book, Against the Corporate Media, 42 Ways the Press Hates You. Ian Gregory has written a expose of some of the worst practices of the BBC, which is one of the most important broadcasting outlets in the world and perhaps the most prestigious. So, Ian, if you would start by summarizing what you said, and that will launch a conversation into the problems that the Beeb has.
Well, the first thing I want to say about the BBC before I launch into a critique of it is there is a lot of good people, good programs, which are journalistically full of integrity there. I do not want to blacken everything about the corporation because to do that, I think is to disregard what is excellent there. I want to look at the BBC as a whole and say, what is its impact on the British political system? And given how dominant it is the degree of bias that it's showing becoming so egregious that it is now a danger to British democracy here, that it keeps conservative politicians out of power, or if they get into power, it stops them from being able to be effective in changing the agenda according to the wishes of the voters who brought them in. So we've just come out of a period of 14 years of Conservative government in the UK, and it's very difficult to see it as having been Conservative in the implementation of its policies. Yeah. It's been a period in which taxes have gone up. We've had a centrally planned approach to COVID, a centrally planned approach to decarbonising the economy. We've had the growth of the woke agenda under a Conservative government for 14 years. And given all that, it's saying, well, why has it been difficult for Conservatives to implement Conservative policies on issues, for example, like immigration? And a lot of it is down to the left ecosystem in which politicians operate. And that at the heart of that ecosystem is the BBC. Unless the BBC is tackled in terms of its huge, oversized impact on the political system, there is no chance for meaningful Conservative Party politics to come in in 5, 10, 15 years from now.
So one might compare the situation here in Britain with that in the United States, in which the New York Times would occupy that place in the popular imagination and in the social system. That is a newspaper who is inordinately influential. And I agree with you about the Beeb, and I've also said this about the Times. The Times can be an excellent newspaper. It can be the best newspaper in the world when it sets its mind to it. But the question is, what is the overall shaping of the message now? So that's something I'd like to pick up now with you, with the BBC. Can you amplify your notions of how they shape the political thinking in this country?
Well, the first of all is this is an extraordinarily large organisation. When we had our election in July, the BBC had 4.2 million people watching its results programme. The nearest competitor was ITV with 1.3 million. So it is a very, very dominant player. And if you're a politician, a scientist, an expert in any field, you want to be on the BBC to create credibility for your views among your colleagues. And so the BBC, if you're out of favour of the BBC, it's very tricky for people to develop their careers. And so this creates the BBC has this ability to create consensus because it's consensus. Because if you speak out of turn with what the BBC believes as an organisation, then you will not be able to have you won't be able to advance your career. So because it has got such a dominant share of the news media in the UK, that is why it's powerful. Now, in terms of what the views of the BBC are, they leak out from its presenters. You had a presenter talking, giving the news of Boris Johnson deciding that he wasn't going to try and become Prime Minister again. And she said, "Am I allowed to be gleeful?" She said that on air, and she was suspended for a while. And but that goes on time and time again. We have the most highly paid BBC presenter, a sports presenter called Gary Lineker, opines all the time on his views on government policy. He said of its flagship policy, this was under the Tory administration, said that he thought it was redolent of Nazi behaviour, and he was extraordinarily vitriolic about it. Now, his views are part of political discourse. You think, fine. But when the BBC gives a huge platform to presenters and they use that to put their political views across, it undermines the brand of the BBC for neutrality, which it aspires to. And these views of so many presenters are giving their views and not being stopped by management. So when Lineker made his very politically charged views on immigration policy, he was suspended, and yet the BBC's staff then went on strike and forced the Director General to back down. And it's this degree of presenter leakage of views, which I think is one way of looking at the BBC on this. Then you have the storylines, the issues that it chooses to look at. So if we look at something like climate change policy, it's given huge voice to groups like Extinction Rebellion, to the emergence of Greta Thunberg. These contributors to the debate, I don't want to stop anybody making an informed view on things. It's a really important debate for us to look at. But when the BBC gives overwhelming dominance to individuals who are just saying we should do more, just do more, where we're not doing enough, more wind farms, it becomes a very monotonous approach to policy, and it stops the richness of any debate coming out, whether it's sort of immigration policy or climate change. All these big, important debating points get a very narrow, shallow treatment by the BBC.
Now, how do you rein in something that big, I think, is the question. You don't want to start censoring the BBC in a way. On the other hand, as you point out, the presenters now not only have their thumb on the scale, but they laugh about it while their thumb is on the scale, right in the customer's face. Yes, I know I'm tilting this story. You know, can I laugh about the misfortune of one of my political enemies? How do we rein that back in? Is this a matter for the Board of Governors? Who's in charge of this?
Well, the BBC is judge and jury on its own performance. And if you're a politician who is critical about the BBC's bias, then you keep stum about it. Otherwise, you're not going to appear on the dominant news outlet in the country. So it stifles the debate about how to deal with bias. So
that's a mafia approach, basically.
Well, you do need institutions like, for example, a judiciary, which prize their independence, their lack of accountability, because it's important to society that judges aren't told what to do by politicians. And likewise, as broadcasters, it's important as well. Now, some organizations get beyond the point of being able to reform themselves. There's a whole bunch of incentives within the organisation to not rock the boat internally, and so if you're a reformer within the BBC, you're not going to last very long. So the hopes for the BBC changing itself, I think, are very limited. What I think is needed is to attack the funding model. Now, the BBC, unlike the New York Times, is paid for out of effectively a poll tax, which is charged per household that you have permission to watch any television program in the BBC, across not just the BBC, across all outlets. To have that license, you need to pay a couple $100 a year.
Yeah.
Now that is paid by all the population, except for those over the age of 75, where they can have a means-tested permission to not have to pay that license fee. Now, it's a only by attacking the funding model, by reducing the size of the BBC, can you hope to bring some discipline to the organisation? Because the managers are empire builders. They don't want to see their particular programmes being shut down. So the funding model is critical. And I think the best route for that is to look at these over 75s who about 5 years ago were told for the first time that they had to pay for the licence fee, and to, unless they have this means-tested benefit, these over 75s, the BBC does not prosecute them for non-payment. And yet they still pay the fee because they're worried they get lots of threatening letters. I think if this group realised that none of their age group are being prosecuted by the BBC, at that point the BBC will realise it's starting to hemorrhage cash. And I think that is the most practical way I can see at the moment, because governments are not going to reduce the BBC's funding. They're scared of the BBC, and the Labour Party feels it's got a sympathetic friend in the BBC largely. So I don't see the governments stepping in here. It's going to be a strike by licence fee payers. There is already evidence of quite sharp reductions in the number of people paying the licence fee. And if that group of over 75s start to say, we're not paying, I think that is the route to the BBC starting to face a crisis on its funding model.
Well, it's curious to an American then that you're being forced to being the propagandizing. You're paying for your own propagandizing essentially by paying the license fee. If you're a non-woke, non-leftist person who wants to just watch television, for example, we don't have that structure in the United States. But Ireland does have that, and there's been a great deal of resistance to paying the licensing fee in Ireland. That's become a political issue now as well. Is there a way to move the BBC off the licensing model entirely? Is that ever proposed, or is this just some vestige of what the the between the war period, whenever the licensing fee started, that we're going to have to live with forever here in the UK?
Well, I think the big question is how much money the BBC will take in, and if they start to see a hemorrhaging of cash, then it will have a very quick impact on BBC programmes. There's been lots of talk about some subscription model for the BBC, and I think the continuance of the licence fee is too convenient to the BBC for it to want to stop. So the BBC will push and push and push for the maintenance of that, and it's only a taxpayer's strike which will change that.
The taxpayers have to voluntarily pay this, is that correct? Or
you can go to prison if you don't pay. So there's a certain cudgel over the head of people to make sure they pay.
Yeah.
And it's just that the over 75s are not being prosecuted by the BBC because the BBC is scared of the media reaction that it would get. So I think that's the Achilles heel of the BBC on its finances.
What about the BBC's presence online? Not just as a broadcasting service, but they have obviously their own website, their news divisions have a website. How does that impact the argument here in the UK?
Well, it's such a dominant player that it squeezes out some potential commercial competition, because there is a demand for news, but if the BBC is providing that news, then it becomes difficult for those other competitors to grow to scale, to have enough bureaus around the world to become a cohesive news organisation. So the BBC squeezes out other models. And I think that just like people are scared in the UK about thinking about a world without the NHS, everybody says that the National Health Service is not performing well. But if you criticise the NHS in any way, you're accused of trying to privatise it and so forth. And this cherished organisation is now performing so badly that reform of the NHS is now coming into view. The BBC is this other cherished organisation. How can you possibly attack something that the Britain is so good at? I think that we have to be bolder about thinking, well, what would a world be like without the BBC? What would step into its place? And a bunch of commercial broadcasters would come in. What if we had 2 or 3 competing versions of the BBC, much smaller, but organisations which are publicly funded to some degree, which were creating competition between the models? What would happen then? And it's the imagination of a world without the BBC, which is the starting point for a proper debate about heading to a future without this dominant monolith here. But we have to, first of all, acknowledge how it is skewing our democratic process here, stopping proper political debate. My day job is as a political lobbyist, and I care passionately about the quality of policy making. If the media is not producing a proper debate about the policy options, if it's just being incredibly shallow as the BBC is on so many issues, then it means that we don't have a proper thinking going on about what we should be doing. And I would love to see a broader debate about policy options, more sophisticated, looking at some of the deep difficulties we have. And the BBC is a blockage to that. It's stopping thoughtful consideration.
Well, you have a catch-22 here, which is that the BBC is a government-financed, indirectly, entity that squeezes out private sector competition, because no private sector startup is going to be able to have news bureaus all over the world the way the BBC does. And yet the BBC is also delivering you political news on which you can make a decision about the government. Now, we do see in Britain, as in America, that the parties change, the government is fired, and a new government comes in, and et cetera. But again, it gets back to the thumb on the scale, doesn't it? That you're getting the news, most people are getting the news from a source that has an inherent bias in favor of the status quo if its party is in power.
Yeah, I don't think the BBC is any more educational on this. It is, on a number of issues, it is a propaganda machine. If you take one of the smaller morality issues, a question of euthanasia, it's very obvious to anybody who watches BBC output that the BBC body of journalists believe that euthanasia should be, in this country, more of the Dutch model, very permissive. That's the view that they keep pushing there. And it's not a search for truth. It's not a open-mindedness. It is the BBC goes down various rabbit holes, and it makes that a rabbit hole the dominating view in the narrative. And open-mindedness is saying that we might be wrong on a particular issue. And that open-mindedness is essential to proper policy making and absolutely at the heart of journalism. But the BBC cannot conceive that there are alternative views. It is on repeat mode time and time again, and it becomes quite dull. The BBC, when it's in preaching mode, is as dull as a bad preacher. Its comedy is relentlessly left-wing, and it becomes very dull if it's just talking, giving the platitudes of woke ideology and just denouncing its people on the right as bigots. It's a very dull approach to media, and I think this is one of the reasons the BBC is shedding audience, because it's not so intellectually engaging as it was, and none of us really like to be preached at relentlessly.
No. Well, Ian Gregory, thank you very much for your thoughts on these very weighty matters, and thanks again for your contribution to Against the Corporate Media.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.